Welcome to Fear and Greed, the week ahead. I'm Sean Aylmer, and as always, at this time on a Monday morning, I'm joined by economist Stephen Koukoulas. You'll find him at thekouk.com, TheKouk.com, and on X using the handle thekouk. Stephen, good morning.
Good morning, Sean.
Stephen, we're in the midst of almost a drought of economic data. I mean, last week we had some interesting, we had sort of housing finance stuff, and we had the National Australia Bank Business Conditions and Sentiment Survey. We had the Westpac Consumer Sentiment Survey. Not a lot. What did all that stuff tell us?
You're right. It's it either rains or it's a drought, as they say. So we had largely a drought, but there were a few snippets in the data that did come out last week on the conditions and confidence in both business and consumers. The thing that's no surprise is that we consumers are collectively still pretty pessimistic. Both the Westpac Consumer Sentiment, the ANZ, Roy Morgan Consumer Conditions were both weak, miserable. They pulled back a bit, and that was the week where we had some income tax cuts being paid. So I think the cost of living issues, fear of rate hikes were cited as reasons why people are feeling gloomy, and that's disconcerting given that consumer spending is over half GDP. But the thing that probably was more important from an economic perspective was the NAB survey, and while business confidence ticked up a bit, business conditions, which is actual activity, ticked down to below the long run average, which is suggesting the businesses are reacting to the slowdown in the economy. And arguably, even more importantly, in my ladder of importance, there was a whole lot of information in the NAB survey about selling prices, labour costs, input costs, and they were all tilting back down again, which is a precursor to inflation. So it says to me that while we're all anxiously awaiting the June quarter CPI at the end of July, maybe we're already moving beyond that, and that the business sector is telling us that inflation, while it might blip up in the June quarter, could well blip down when we get the September quarter data.
It's interesting because that real-time data shows us, obviously, in real time what's happening, and most of the ABS stuff, we are looking backwards. Something that the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said last week was kind of interesting. He was appearing before Congress, and he just made the point that it wasn't just about getting prices down. It was also about not going too far or not waiting too long before they cut interest rates, because he doesn't want to put the economy into a recession.
Yeah, they were really interesting comments. It sort of seemingly spiked the equity market to new highs, and but the bond market didn't really react all that much. But what his point was is that you don't wait till you hit the brick wall before you start turning the steering wheel. You know you're heading towards the 2% inflation target, or the US is. And before you get there, you've got to start adjusting policy so that you don't overshoot, that you don't get inflation to 1%, which would be a bad outcome, because it would inevitably mean the economy is weaker, unemployment's higher, and as Powell was alluding to, we have a recession. And that's the sort of issue that the central banks around the world are grappling with. And you reminded me of Glenn Stevens, the former RBA governor here in Australia, and he was the master, I suppose, of preemptive policy. He adjusted policy before the economy hit the brick wall, so to speak. So he was one that said, look, we think that, the economy is weak, and if we wait too long to adjust interest rates, we'll be too late.
I suppose the flip side to that, you could argue that Phil Lowe, the previous Reserve Bank governor, the one after Glenn Stevens, waited too long before lifting interest rates, and the economy was already out of control.
Yes, that was, in hindsight, and even at the time, some of us were saying, come on, and we were moving from a cash rate of 0.1%, don't forget.
Yeah.
Be preemptive. And again, even this discussion now, and in the US or Australia, or in fact, the European Central Bank or Bank of England, wherever, I don't think anybody's talking about wholesale hundreds of basis points of rate cuts. What we are talking about is perhaps just give a couple of 25-point rate cuts, and then just see how the economy is going. And if the economy turns out to be weak, we've delivered a little bit of easing. We're not too far behind the curve. Whereas if they wait, then you get the scenario that we saw in the hiking cycle, and you get central banks moving in 50 basis point increments. I hope we don't get to that level, in that position.
Okay, this week we get some pretty interesting information about our local economy, particularly in terms of how it's affecting the labour market. The unemployment stats from the Bureau of Statistics comes out. What are you expecting?
Yeah, between now and the 6th August RBA decision on interest rates, we get the inflation numbers at the end of July. But on Thursday this week, we've got the labour market numbers, and I think they're equally important. The RBA, with its new mandate, has got an eye on the inflation rate, but it's also got an eye on the labour market. Look, the consensus is that we're going to see a slightly softer employment number, about plus 25,000. And while that might sound high, remember that the population growth of the Australian economy means we need to see 35 to 40,000 a month to keep the unemployment rate steady. And that means that the consensus is for the unemployment rate to either hold at 4% or edge up to 4.1% as part of this general economic slowdown that we're seeing.
Okay, so the labour market, I mean, even what Jerome Powell said last week about, in your analogy, about turning the car before it hits a brick wall, and the fact, I mean, the labour market reflects all that, doesn't it?
It does. And look, and again, that's important. And even in the US, because last week we saw the US labour market numbers, and their unemployment rate in an economy that's been remarkably resilient has gone up by 0.7 percentage points. Unemployment was as low as 3.4% about a year ago. It's now 4.1%. In Australia, ahead of this week's figures, we've had the unemployment rate go from 3.5 to 4.0, probably 4.1% as well. So the unemployment rate's starting to creep up. You don't want it to hit 4.5 or 5% before you start a rate cutting cycle. And I think that's what the RBA will tell us when we preview the RBA board meeting in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, Stephen, enjoy your week.
Thank you, Sean.
That was economist Stephen Koukoulas, better known as The Kook. You can find him at thekook.com and follow him on X using the handle The Kook. I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed, the week ahead.